that saves a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see.
Sight. It is our light on the world. Driven by the quest to preserve and improve sight, ophthalmologists have long been at the cutting edge of advancements that shed new light on improving vision. Born to invent, Dr. Harold Ridley is one of ophthalmology's pioneers.
When I was about 7, I said to Mummy, we're out shopping. I want to be an inventor. I can't help inventing things. When I was a boy, I made all sorts of toys.
As Dr. Ridley grew into adulthood, his inventiveness likewise matured. It proved invaluable when, as an ophthalmic surgeon during wartime, he had to improvise surgical procedures because the correct operating instruments were not always available. But as Harold Ridley would soon discover, few procedures would be as controversial within the medical community as was his intraocular lens implementation. He had first begun thinking about the procedure when he became a house surgeon at St. Thomas's Hospital.
I talked to my father, who was an ophthalmic surgeon, and saying that I had a patient in St. Thomas's or Moorfields, St. Thomas's, who had a trivial injury but an intraocular foreign body. He's given a cataract in one eye, and the other eye was quite normal. He was a skilled workman, and his career was completely ruined because he lost binocular vision. He only had one eye. Couldn't use two eyes together. So I said how nice it would be to put a new lens in. My father said it's impossible, it's dangerous. The eye is a very delicate organ. And my great teacher, Arthur Huddy, Mr. Hudson, was always against inserting foreign bodies. He said, we take foreign bodies out of eyes, we don't put them in.
Modern-day lens extraction had its origin in the 1700s, but Dr. Harold Ridley had the vision for what would become among the most dramatic developments in ophthalmic surgery, PMMA lens implantation following extracapsular cataract extraction.
Modern cataract surgery really commenced about the middle of the 18th century, when Jacques de Viel of Bernay in Brittany, France, performed the first formal cataract extraction, which took the form of removing the nucleus of the lens and the soft lens matter from below, an extracapsular procedure. But of course, these patients had to have cataract spectacles, big, thick, heavy, horrible things, in order to see, because otherwise they were virtually blind. And that was a state of affairs for 200 years until Ridley came along and completed the cataract operation by inserting an artificial lens. It seemed a simple enough concept now, does it not?
So I knew it was right. I knew that I had something to offer. Mankind had been waiting since 1745, 200 years, for someone to have the courage to face it. And I was the man. I was given the genes to do it.
During World War II, Dr. Ridley had treated many British pilots who had suffered eye injuries when their shattered canopies spewed plexiglass fragments into their eyes. He observed that this did not necessarily lead to eye loss, provided the fragments were stationary. He also concluded that because tissue reaction to the foreign body was insignificant, both glass and acrylic appeared to be inert within body tissues. Ultimately, this led to Dr. Ridley originating the intraocular lens and its implantation procedure.
We decided to copy nature as closely as possible. God doesn't make many mistakes.
Dr. Ridley contacted optometrist John Pike of the English optical company Rayner to tell him what he was planning.
Mr. Pike, I'm going to have a new project. I'm going to construct an artificial lens to reform the internal optics of the eye, instead of having external optics. Would you be prepared to help me? He said, my hat, I would. Yes, certainly. And I said, we decided that we would use perspex, not glass, because it was lighter in weight. But he said, well, if you use perspex, I must talk to my friend in ICI, John Holt, and get him to make some pure perspex, because the commercial quality is not pure enough. So that was a great advance. That was Mr. Pike's work.
Finding the right candidate for the procedure took over a year.
Oh, I had to ask for volunteers. I had to find a patient who had a unilateral cataract. The other eye was quite normal. So she was working on one, he or she was working on one eye. And if the worst came to the worst, she lost her blind eye. It wasn't so bad. So I had to choose a patient with a unilateral cataract. Secondly, one who volunteered to take the risks.
On February 8, 1949, Dr. Ridley performed the world's first intraocular lens implantation. It took place at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, England.
I was lucky in that the start of my ophthalmic training, January 1948, I was seconded to Harold Ridley's unit, and we got along fine. He was an outstanding intellect and a wonderful operator, and quite honestly, I really worshipped the man. Not the easiest of people in the sense that he did not suffer fools gladly, but we still managed. And I was enthralled by his plans for rounding off the cataract operation by inserting an artificial lens.
My first acquaintance with him was as a medical student at St. Thomas's in 1949, when he taught me ophthalmology as a student. But my first personal contact with him was 2 years later, when, as a resident in general surgery at St. Thomas's, I discovered that I would not be able to continue with a career in general surgery because of an old injury, and was therefore seeking an alternative and was attracted to ophthalmology. Harold Ridley very kindly agreed to interview me. And I digress at this present, simply to show some of his charming qualities, in that he was the only consultant at that time who would bother to sit down, take you aside, describe to you the steps that were necessary to make a career in the specialty, and to set it out clearly. This, I found, was a most enormous encouragement and help. About 2 years later, I was lucky enough to become his house surgeon at St. Thomas's. This was in the early 50s, and this was at the time that he was developing his original implant operation, and it was my privilege to assist him with many of these early operations. One has to remember that the instrumentation which Harold used in those days concerned instruments which carried the names of and were designed by men of the 19th century: von Graeff's knife, de Vecker's scissors, Hesse's capsule forceps. There were no microscopes or operating microscopes at that time. There was no viscoelastic aids, there was no emulsification, there were no microsutures. But what Harold lacked in modern aids, he made up in dexterity. He was supremely dexterous.
Because the procedure was considered to be so radical, the first implant surgery was done quietly and without fanfare. However, word of it spread in a rather unusual way.
Let me tell you a funny story. I did an operation on a hospital patient for no fee from the National Health Service. I did one of these special operations of mine with a new lens, which I bought for 18 shillings. And the patient was delighted. So he thought he would be, in fairness, like Mr. Ridley, to get a fee for the other, but he couldn't get a fee in the National Health Service. So he made an appointment. He looked in the phone book, went down the page, found Ridley, ophthalmic surgeon, and made an appointment to see Mr. Ridley. Little did he know that there were two ophthalmic surgeons called Ridley. The other was Frederick, and F comes before H. So he found, he went in to see Mr. Ridley. He started having an appointment. And the man, he said, "You're not Mr. Ridley." He said, "I am." He said, "You're not the man who did this marvelous operation." He said, "No, I don't do marvelous operations." Anyway, that's how the news came out. And he had told people he'd seen this eye with the implant. It's reading 20/20, and the news was out.
Dr. Ridley was senior surgeon at St. Thomas's Hospital and at Moorfields Eye Hospital. Dr. Eric Arnott interned under Dr. Ridley at Moorfields.
He always looked upon St. Thomas's Hospital as his home from home. He loved working at St. Thomas's Hospital and used to try to coax all the up-and-coming young eye surgeons to do a house job at St. Thomas's. He also had incredible power at Moorfields Eye Hospital. And at the time that I first came to London, it seemed that Harold Ridley was the only surgeon on the staff that had the ultimate power about who would go on the internship at Moorfields. When I finished my initial eye training in Dublin, I came to London fortified with 4 letters from my teacher, Beecher Somerville Large. One of these letters was addressed to Harold Ridley. I therefore had, from the moment I arrived at Moorfields, a personal contact with this great man.
As a mentor, Dr. Ridley took his role seriously.
This was one of the things that Harold did. He took tremendous interest in the young and seeing who would be the most suitable for getting on the house at Moorfields. And in the whole of my years at Moorfields, he was the person that would decide who should be appointed.
Though some praised him in the early years for his advancement, the resistance among mainstream ophthalmology was considerable.
To begin with, Ridley was like a dog with 2 tails at the success of his operation. And he really thought he would take the rest of the profession by storm. But it did not work out like that.
A particularly difficult blow was the adverse reaction to his address in 1951 to the American Academy of Ophthalmology in Chicago, to which he'd been invited.
He suffered a great deal of abuse in this concept of replacing the crystalline lens with a plastic lens. Yet despite that, he survived, and since then has been honored, sadly, far more out of this country than within it.
In 1974, the climate of opinion changed dramatically. At the satellite meeting that the International Intraocular Implant Club held in Paris at the end of this international congress, which had resolutely refused to put on the program any papers about intraocular lenses. So I set up this satellite meeting in the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel in 1974, May 1974, attended by about 400, 500 ophthalmologists, of whom I should think 300 at least were from North America. And they got the message, loud and clear, that lens implantation was the way to go.
He wasn't fully appreciated by his own country, but he's certainly appreciated by ophthalmology.
There have been many advances and improvements by many in the field, but there probably is no other single advance that's helped more people all around the world and will continue to do, regardless of what new things come along, than your idea. And you singularly had the guts to pursue an idea, and most of all, you put up with the tremendous attacks against you personally that you had to live through. And that makes you the real hero of the field of ophthalmology, as well as one of its greatest inventors.
If you go down to his little cottage, Keeper's Cottage, by a small stream in Wiltshire, a thatched little cottage where he lives with his wife Elizabeth, on the side is a book. In the book, there are signatures of over 3,000 ophthalmologists worldwide who attest to the importance of his work, and they are the tribute of world ophthalmologists to Harold Ridley, the pioneer of lens implants.
In 1986, Dr. Harold Ridley was made a Fellow of the Royal Society, which he considered to be among the greatest honors in science that one could receive. But when all is said and done, Dr. Ridley is quite specific about how he would like to be remembered.
I'm going to have on my tombstone, he cured aphakia. And people will go and say, who was aphakia?